And now I'd like to introduce our author for the night. Alma Alexander's life so far has prepared her very well for her chosen career. She was born in a country which no longer exists on maps, has lived and worked in 7 countries on 4 different continents and in cyberspace. She's climbed mountains, dived in coral reefs, flown small planes, swum with dolphins, touched 2,000-year-old tiles in a gate out of Babylon, and she is a novelist, anthologist, and short story writer who currently shares her life between the Pacific Northwest of the USA, where she lives with 2 obligatory writer's cats.
One of whom is right.
Wonderful fantasy worlds of her own imagination. And she is here today presenting this science fiction book, The Second Star. Please welcome Alma Alexander.
If the cat would let me do anything at all. The cat you just saw, this little beast, this is Blackjack. But I'm trying to get him to go out of my lap. Come on. Oh, no. Okay. All right. Down. Thank you. Good evening. I'm ruled by felines, as you can see. So welcome and thank you for being here. Today I wanted to share this book, which has recently become a finalist in the Washington State Book Awards. And before that, it was a finalist in the Imagine Awards. So it's been well looked at and well received. Just as an introduction from the back blurb, just to give you an idea where we're going here, it says the Parada, the ship Parada, had been lost for almost 200 years before they recovered the ship, drifting in the Stygian interstellar darkness, and brought her home again. But that was not the miracle. The miracle was that the crew was still alive. That was also the problem. 6 people went out to the stars. More than 70 fractured personalities came back. It was an interesting book to write. It had way more characters than looked like were present from just looking at the surface. And I'm going to read you two little sections, one of which is going to introduce you to at least 2 of the characters, 2 of the crew, before they went out. And the other is one of my favorite passages from the book because it gave me space and license to be lyrical about things. And I just wanted to share that with you. But before I do that, let me just introduce you to the crew. No comment from the peanut gallery. They had been household names, the crew of the Parada, when the ship set out to the stars, specifically to explore exoplanets discovered during the early 21st century, probes launched into the Alpha Centauri and Proxima Centauri systems. 6 heroes who stepped on board humanity's first starship purely on faith. The world had waved them goodbye with tears of pride and had held its collective breath as the rendezvous rocket took when the media had branded the 6 of the stars up into the shipyard in Earth orbit where their craft awaited them. The Parada, new built, shining with promise, with dreams, with hope. Captain Hanford Milgar, First Officer Jerry Hillerman, Navigator Rob Hillerman, Engineer Bogdan Dimitrov, Ship's Medic Alaya McGinty, Science Officer and Astronomer Lily Mae Washington. Their faces were on every screen in every home. Children were taken out of school to watch the launch of the rendezvous rocket, and then again when the cameras in orbit showed the Parada slowly easing out of dock, hanging there as though posing for a close-up against the backdrop of space, glittering with stars, and then turning away from the home planet, nose pointed into the dark. The people of Earth watched her begin moving away, getting smaller and smaller until she vanished from sight. For a little while, the media kept up with the ship, passing on such telemetry data as was received back. There were even occasional messages from a 6 to the stars sent while the ship still tiptoed her way through the solar system, passing Mars, sending images of Saturn that became as iconic as that first photograph of Earth hanging in the black skies of the moon had been back in the days of the moonshots, because those were literally the first images of a distant planet which had been taken by living human hands while living human eyes rested on it. But then the star drive kicked in, news from the ship became scarcer, and then other things took over the headlines as other things do. The next time the Parada returned to the news was when word came that contact from the ship had been lost. And then 100 more years went by. The six to the stars were recognizable, vivid, remembered faces because they had been who they had been. They were written into history. Generations of children had learned their names in classes. Millions had mourned them when they were presumed lost. But they were gone from living memory. No human on Earth in the present day had been alive when the Parada had left the planet. Seeing those historic faces and actual flesh and blood people under surveillance by way of CCTV cameras changed so little from the images remembered from historical documents that for Stella it had been 2 centuries ago in a room only a few corridors away from the one in which she was sitting had shaken Stella Froud more than she knew. She fought down her feelings, squashed thoughts and resurrection and immortality. But she still felt uncanny as she accessed her computer terminal and asked for material dating from the time of the Parada's launch. She would start there at the beginning. She didn't know what she was looking for other than she would recognize it when she saw it. So she deliberately scrambled the chronology, accessing things at random rather than in order, assimilating the material she was presented with as she observed it. Some of the stuff she already knew. It was widely known and public knowledge. Some she knew, some she had once known and forgotten, and some of it was a revelation. Rob and Jerry Hillerman were a bottomless source of entertainment. They could range from the ridiculous to the profound, sometimes pivoting disconcertingly from one to the other in the space of a single interview, giving little warning. There was an entire subject of study right there for those so inclined. Stella pushed the button invoking the privacy zone, soundproofing her console from anyone else working in the area. She watched several video interviews with the pair, falling into the same fascination that they held for audiences of 2 centuries before. Are you happy that you're going out there together? A once very famous anchor of a morning chat show on TV asked brightly, flashing a smile too full of perfect teeth and wearing hair that looked like it had been sprayed on. The twins, lounging on a red couch in poses that were so identical that a viewer's eyes watered at the prospect of simply seeing double, chose to answer this one seriously, at first anyway. Well, we thought about it, Rob said. Quite a lot, actually. We knew that there had been at least 2 instances back in the days of the early space station crews when they sent out one of a pair of twins and kept the other one back on Earth to compare with afterwards. A control experiment, Jerry said, as in, would outer space change one human and leave his planet-bound twin untouched? Or would there be no changes at all? Or would the magic of twins kick in and the planet-bound twin would suddenly sprout the same pointed ears and cat-pupiled alien eyes that the guy up there somehow got? Jerry was always the snarkier of the two. When they did do the twin act, it was usually Jerry who began it. But he was trying to derail the subject here. He just couldn't help being who he was. And you didn't want to be a lab rat, the anchor said sweetly. Rob actually smiled. Tightly, but he managed to smile. Look, he said, when it came to those early instances, the spacefaring twin was just up there in orbit, might stay there for a month or a year or whatever, but still Earth was just there. If necessary, there was the illusion that all he needed to do to get home would be to just strap on a parachute and jump. It wasn't like, a permanent split, a terminal goodbye, Jerry said, and he wasn't for once smiling at all. We understood on a deep level that if we were chosen for this mission, it would be unlikely that we would see each other again in this lifetime. And if we, by some miracle, did, things would be very different. Time dilation is too complicated, perhaps, to get into here, Rob said. But if one of us went and the other one stayed behind, the one who returned, if he returned, would return as still relatively young. If he found the other, the one who stayed behind, still alive to greet him, the one who had waited would be an old, old man, having lived a sundered life. You don't understand, you can't, the bond between twins, unless you are one. We both knew that we wanted the stars, but with us it was a double or nothing deal all the way. Both of us went or neither. We did not want to think about the consequences of anything else. But you wanted the stars, the anchor prodded. Rob looked up and there was something in his eyes that made Stella hold her breath, or even all these years later. Always, he said, and his voice had softened to the point that the mic he was wearing on the set almost struggled to catch the words. We would both stand out in our backyard and count them, what we could see of them. We lived too close to a big city, and London lights did their best to drown out the stars. We grew up with a washed out sky. But our uncle took us fishing in the summers, Jerry said. And out there in the country, the stars were different, closer, more real. And then we'd go home, Rob said, and then they'd disappear again. But once we had seen them, we could not forget that they were there somewhere, lost in the haze. And the less we saw of them, the more we wanted them. So we decided to become spacemen any way we could. We devoured education, Jerry said. We skipped at least a quarter of your average kid's school-going years because we kept on jumping grades. We were doing college courses at the same time as we were sitting our O-levels. That's graduating high school, sort of, for you Yanks. By the time we'd finished our A-levels, we'd also accumulated nearly 2 years' worth of college credits. We made short work of the rest. We both graduated college before we were 20 and had advanced degrees by the time we were 25. And then you joined the World Space Agency. It was the European Space Agency still for about a year after we joined. And then the mergers happened and everyone finally pooled resources and knowledge. And that was the reason we could accomplish the Parada, Jerry said. Before that ship, yes, we joined the Space Agency, and we did so with the full knowledge that we might well end up being one of those twin experiments that they seem to be so fond of. Like I said, we knew that coming in. It was an acceptable level of risk. Even with those straight up miles of air and space that would separate us, if they split us, we would still be essentially connected by the same world. But then they came to us about the Starship. They approached us separately, Rob said, with the same tight smile he'd worn before. We'd been given no chance to talk to one another about it, but we gave them the same answer individually, even without the opportunity to discussing it. That far was too far. We both said we would stand ready to go out there if chosen for the mission, but only together or not at all. They agreed. So what is it that draws you there in the end? Rob got that faraway look again, the one that made Stella's hackles rise. It's the stars, he said, and his voice had dropped again. It was as though he couldn't speak about this except in hushed tones, as though it was almost too big a miracle to utter out loud at all. I wanted to look at the stars up close, to look the stars in the eye, he said. We are all star stuff, you know that, don't you? The molecules inside you and me were all forged in the heart of a star once. The stars are our brothers. I always knew they were there waiting for me. And when this chance was offered to me, it wasn't the WSA that I heard calling me. It was their voices, the high, sweet voices of those stars, where I was always meant to be. Yes, Jerry said, only that. It was remarkably easy to hold that depth in the corner of his attention when Stella watched a different show, a late-night chat show, which was clearly more entertainment than informational, and the twins responded accordingly. So what do you plan on doing up there? The host asked, grinning broadly. The same thing we do down here, said Jerry. Finish each other's sentences, drive everyone mad, be the thing that keeps everyone sane up there, make everyone laugh. There's going to be a need for finding things to laugh about as when things go wrong, as they inevitably will, as they always do. The host lifted both hands in surrender, laughing. I almost wish I was going with you, he said, and sounded almost sincere about it. Probably not, Jerry said. And that's okay, Rob said. Not everyone is cut out for this stuff. Everyone else was laughing. The two of them weren't. Not quite. They were smiling, but there was always a part of them that knew exactly where they were and what they were doing and how they were doing it. And they were a tag team, whatever they did. Drive everyone mad. And here they now were, and the world called them mad instead. Was the presence of twins a factor in what had happened? Could it have been? Could this rapid disintegration of personality have occurred because there was already a split personality up there as a model, these two men who were obviously capable of thinking as a single mind if necessary? Or should it have made them immune to the splittage, already carrying, as it were, parts of each other's personality? Stella tapped out a note to herself on her phone. The Hillermans might hold at least part of the key to the mystery of what had happened to the crew of the Parada. We meet Rob Hillerman again in the second excerpt that I want to read to you. Let me just preface this by, they came back, they were brought back as they split personalities, and they were basically sequestered away in a place where nobody knew that they were back because they couldn't be allowed to be seen. It was too much of an unknown. And Stella, their psychologist, took it upon herself to get them back out and under the open sky again. She took them up to a rooftop garden. It broke Stella's heart to watch the crew step out of the rooftop garden, slowly, stealthily, warily, as though they expected every shadow to attack them. She remembered once seeing, back when she was very young and very affected by such things, old videos of dogs used in laboratory experiments back in the days when they still used live animals to test chemicals. A rescue group had acquired a handful of beagles that had been reared from very young puppyhood inside the laboratory, dogs which had never seen the outside of a lab, never felt the wind in their ears, never had their paws touch grass or dirt. They brought the dogs out into a patch of lawn in someone's backyard and they set the carriers out there with the doors open, leaving the dogs to explore on their own terms. Stella had wept when she had watched the wary animals sit cowering for a long, long time in their carrier cages until one brave soul decided to put an experimental paw out, touch grass, pull the paw back in consternation and stare at that unfamiliar surface. Then slowly, slowly touch the grass again, put its weight on that foot, take another paw and let it rest in the grass, trembling, its nose sucking in the new smells and questing for danger. And then, when one of the dogs had finally gathered enough courage to emerge, the others did, one by one, until they all stood on the grass in joyful bewilderment, disbelieving what their senses were telling them. Those dogs had ended up in that video, racing around the grass with abandon, simply accepting the fact of their freedom, and a sense of a new life that was about to open up for them as they danced, darted, rolled, permitted themselves at last to be touched and hugged by humans who loved them instead of using them as living records of scientific data. Stella didn't know if that kind of a happy ending was even possible for the Parada crew, but she watched them stepping on the rooftop garden with the same weary anxiety as those captive beagles, as though they were touching grass for the first time. The moon was full and bathed the garden in a white light, casting sharp shadows. It was September, late in the season, but some lingering roses were still blooming, and a few of them, the dark red ones, black in the pale moonlight, were the ancient kind that still possessed the rich scent that had once made them so beloved. The air in the garden was redolent with that perfume. Stars glittered palely in the sky, but the tower rose above the city and the lights spilled a long way below and the ground washed out the brightness that might have been the glory of the night sky. Some stars were there, though, and Stella saw Elias stand rooted with both feet flat on the ground and her arms straight down by her side and both hands splayed out as though she were trying to keep her balance on a swaying ship. Her head thrown straight back, her eyes gazing up into the sky, avidly, as though she was trying to count the stars that she could glimpse up there. Han Milgar wore a faint smile on his face, gazing both upward at the sky and outward across the lights of the city and, further out, the abrupt darkness that was open water. This might be quite the sight in the light of day, Han remarked, directing the remark at nobody in particular. This was his world, the world he had given his mind, his body, his life to, and all that it had left to give him in return was a glimpse of city lights in the darkness of the night sea and a scattering of faded stars. Stella felt a stab of something that felt strangely like guilt, although she had done nothing to claim responsibility for any of what had happened to the captain of the Parada. Lily May, her eyes on the ground and not the sky, had padded over to the very edge of the garden and was gazing avidly out over the city. Stella's instincts tingled, and she was on the point of crossing to Lily May in case she needed some steadying attention. But just as she was about to move, she felt a light hand on her elbow and turned to see Philip by her side, his eyes also on the slender woman standing alone in a tangle of moon shadows. "I got this," he said softly. Stella hesitated and then nodded. Philip crossed the grass to where Lily May stood. Stella could see barely more than silhouette shapes at this distance, but Lily May's head turned at Philip's approach, and then she and Philip leaned in towards one another, engaged in a whispered conversation she could not hear. She scanned the garden for the others again. The moonlight glittered off Boz Dimitrov's cheeks, as though his eyes overflowed with tears. There was something about the stillness of his figure that suddenly made Stella think of emptiness, as though it was just a shell of a body with everything that had once been inside it, now gone, fled. To the stars? She could not see where his gaze was fixed precisely, but there was a sort of focus there, as though he was searching for something very specific, for the glint of passion in a lover's eyes. Stella felt as though she would be intruding at something close and intimate if she disturbed him, and she made the decision to rely on Jelly Hillerman, who still stuck close to Boz's side, silent, close enough to Stella for her to notice his nose flaring at the scent of the roses that wafted past him, to intervene if it became necessary. A few steps away, gazing at the sky in what looked a little more like a relaxed position than Elias, but still revealed a tight focus on the visible stars scattered across the night sky, Rob Hillerman stood with his arms crossed across his chest, smiling faintly. Stella drifted over towards him. You know, he said, apparently aware of her approach before she came nearly close enough to have been detected, and certainly before she had said anything out loud. I feel like a boy again, staring at the skies washed by city lights, knowing that the stars were out there, finding it hard to see them. And tonight, with the city and the moon. Are you okay? Stella asked incongruously. This had seemed like such a good idea. And it might have been if there had been 6 of her, 1 for each crew member, 1 shadow to watch each of them, and gauge their reactions and remember them and file them away and see how they responded to breathing the free air of home once again. She did stop to acknowledge the irony of wishing she had the gift of splitting herself up just like her subjects had done, if only to study their own fractures better. But even while keeping a corner of her eye on everyone, ready to react to the most minuscule of changes as soon as she could perceive it, she now found her attention focused on Rob. If he had been one of those beagles she had wept over, he had been the one to have had the ancestral memory of grass, dug it out from somewhere, buried deep in his subconscious, and he would have been the one to simply accept it, love it, take it as something that belonged to him and was rightfully a part of his world. He was relaxed. The word she was groping for was content. He just fit in this place, in this moment, as though the world had been shaped around him and bent so that he could find a comfortable place within it. And yet, when he spoke, it was in a voice Stella recognized and shivered to hear. I remember this place, said the poet in that rich velvet tone that had raised Stella's hackles the first time she had heard it. When I was a child, I dwelled in a garden with high walls, and I was safe there and contented and protected, and nothing evil could ever happen to me there because this was home, and it was a happy place full of light. I thought it was the whole world, and I was ready to accept that world, those walls, those boundaries, because they kept me safe and happy. It even perhaps smelled of these very same blessed roses, and the very same blessed faint stars twinkled above it. And I was young and innocent, and I knew only that comfort that surrounded me and gave me value in the context of that place and shaped me into that small young thing, ignorant of all but only the things that I knew were real to me, because I could touch and taste and smell them, and happy in that ignorance. Hey, said Stella, her voice a little unsteady. We agreed. The poet turned to look at her, those large luminous eyes glittering in the moonlight. But I grew up, he went on relentlessly, still wearing that same faint smile that played around the corners of his lips. I grew up and I've passed the gates and I've been beyond the walls. And I've seen the shadows that teem on the outside, the shadows with claws and with teeth and with terrible glowing eyes of hunger and covetousness, the shadows that would devour you. I've seen them and I've known the fear of them. But I have faced them and I have faced that fear, and I understand now. Without those shadows, even just the stories of those shadows, the bright light in that childhood garden could never have been so beloved and so bright. I've stood outside the walls and they look so small, so fragile from here. And yet I remember clearly how high and how strong they seemed to me when I still dwelt within them. I have left the garden of my childhood and I have walked the wilderness that lies all around it, and I have fought its traps and its monsters, and sometimes I win and sometimes I lose. But there is one thing that I never knew before I stepped into that wild desert, and that is that the place is stark and deadly and beautiful beyond reason. It isn't safe, it isn't protected, but it's free, and its shadows sing, and the songs are sung with the voices of dark angels. And once you have heard those songs, you are lost forever. His arms unfolded, his hands dropping to his sides, his breath escaping with a sigh. You can never return, you know, he said. You can never come home again, not truly home. You can never come back to that safe, happy garden where you were a child. Because the wilderness leaves its seeds in you, and the seeds sprout no matter how hard you try to stop them, and something takes root inside of you, and in the fullness of time it blooms. A flower that is dark, so dark, and yet it is velvet to the touch, and it is full of stars, and its name is yearning, a yearning for what you know is out there, will always be out there, the knowledge that there will always be more. He stopped and fully turned to look at Stella, who stood speechless with tracks of tears on her cheeks. The poet was gone. It was Rob Hillerman who stood there again, and it was he who reached out with a gentle hand and wiped the tears from her face. I'm sorry, he said, and sounded genuinely regretful. That was an ill way to repay a miracle. Thank you for this. It means more than you can ever know. I suspect you'll be made to pay for it, though. They called me here to try and understand what happened, to heal you, Stella said, trying to stop her voice from sounding thready with her suppressed tears. That's all I'm trying to do. I don't think they meant this, Rob said, gesturing at the garden, at the moon, with a wave of his hand. I actually think I haven't allowed myself to dwell on it, but tonight made me realize it is entirely possible they will never let us go free. How can they? We are monsters now, the monsters who came back from the deep, and the deep has touched us and changed us. That is all that they will ever see now. Everything else pales in the light of that. Even though it was all a comedy of errors, a chain of accidents, the possible folly of sending Jerry and myself out there together for the universe to find, and for some intelligent part of that universe to assume that the somewhat odd, almost schizophrenic, deep shared twin bond is the way that the human mind is supposed to function, and that maybe it is our fault that we... He stopped speaking abruptly, but Stella's hair was standing on end, although she still didn't completely understand why. All she knew was that she was hearing for the first time the truth behind what had happened to the Parada, and there might be more to that truth than anybody had imagined. She narrowed her focus into one particular phrase of what Rob had just said. Some intelligent part of the universe, she questioned softly. His eyes had changed again, and what she saw there began to frighten her. Maybe you'd better gather us up again, he said, and his accent changed, broadened, became something out of an old-time gangster movie. We all made a promise, but there are some promises you can't expect us to keep. Maybe it's too late after all. He glanced up at the sky, and the fierceness of that look stabbed Stella to the heart. It was as though he was trying to gather it all up, put it all inside of him, treasure it there, a memory of something that he didn't know that he would ever see again with mortal eyes. Thank you, he said, his voice tight. Take us back, now, while you still can. The story of what happened to the Parada 6 or the Parada 17, however you choose to call them. It was an intricate, difficult, joyful book to write. And I'm so very proud of this book. So I hope that you will choose to read the rest of it. Second star. If you have any questions or comments, the chat is open to the side of the screen. I'm open for commentary now.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I sent one. I was just wondering if it was a standalone, which it sounds like it is. But please, it's not too late to send questions if you have them. You can still send them while I'm talking here. But if not, I'll go ahead and wrap things up. So thank you so much, Alma. I know this book is on my reading list. I know that much. It sounds very exciting. And thank you for sharing it with us. Thank you to our audience members for joining us today. We love having the online events, and please remember that you may purchase Second Star from the website, and I'm sending that link into the chat right now. You may also view this event from the YouTube channel as well as other past events. And yes, Alma, I will talk with Alma and decide a date, or I'll email her and we can brainstorm a date. for her to come in because she'll be dropping off stickers that go with the book. And then if you would like it signed, that will be the date will be signed as well. Just call the store and we'll set one aside for you to be signed, and with any personalizations you would like as well. So if you want it to be signed to a specific person. And yes, and please enjoy the rest of your night. Alma, do you have any last words at all?
Thank you for coming.
Yes.
And thank you for sharing this book with me. It's been a very special book for me I might actually tell you that it came out because I dreamed the first concept of it in a single sentence that just got left behind on the shores of sleep when I woke up in the morning, and the sentence was, "A soul is like a starfish."
Wow.
Basically, if you cut off one limb, it comes back and grows another one. And then I started talking about exploring the idea with my husband, who is always my sounding board. And the book just grew like a mushroom. And what came out was this glorious story.
That's beautiful. I love sci-fi. For those of you that don't know, so I'm very excited for this one. Yes. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Alma, so much. And I wish you all a great night.
Good night.